Hello to all the viewers, listeners, and everyone else. My name is Isaac Rocio, and this is William von der Palen, and this is Futucast. Welcome. Let's jump straight into the episode. This time we have, as our guest, a doctor of political science, ambassador, a former diplomat,
Alpo Rusi.
and a current podcast guest king, Alpo Rusi. Welcome to Futucast. Thank you. First of all, what's up? How has it felt to be on podcasts so much lately? This has probably been a new thing for you in recent years. Well, let's say yes. It has been a new thing. Probably since the start with Jari Sarasvuo in 2020, quite late. But I have noticed that this is especially popular in many ways. And many of my professor colleagues have joined in. And it has encouraged me in the direction that this is a relevant addition to the media, that we can use these days. Yes, it is a very interesting development if you think back to where podcasts started, where in the United States Joe Rogan was just doing some kind of comedy challenge, and what that development has been like in the last 20 years. And now many podcasts are as relevant as big media companies, at least a good addition to the field. Yes, I think we get to examine things a bit more closely here, when in this a studio broadcast television format some people have got tightened up in a few sentences, and discussions often end when they are supposed to start. Exactly. That is often the problem. I have been watching the studio from time to time, and you can clearly see the benefit. According to the direction, there is some kind of structure to it. But it is a shame that you can't get into those two-way arguments, which are the salt of the discussion, the salt of their ideas. Usually the second question is left unanswered. When the first question can be answered, then the next question is suggested, and then we move on to the next one. And if we talk about international politics and foreign politics, the expert spectrum has been too narrow. And it shows that our Russian politics in the 20th century has become too narrow for experts. You could almost say that it has been propagated into the kind of Russian politics that came to an end in 2022. And we should have had a wider spectrum of opinion for the people. Because the traditional way of thinking had already come to the fore in the early 2000s. But the traditional way of thinking was continued in the winter of 2022. Do you mean that the media formats had made it difficult for people to accept that opinions don't to be justified or criticized? Maybe so. I would rather not to use always the term Finlandization, because it is a bit of a wrong term sometimes, because it was a much worse situation back then than now, which is just a kind of caution in opinions, or a bit of giving in that a bear does not bite. It's a kind of a superficial analysis. If we go deeper, we understand that we started to behave in foreign politics as a loyal supporter of the Soviet Union and Russia, and especially in the 2000s we had a neighbor border country, and were proud that we had good relations, whereas the Baltics had bad relations, and we did not understand why. The Baltics had bad relations. Of course they had bad relations, because they saw the Russian development in a deeper way than we wanted to see. And this is a place for a follow-up discussion. Now that we've gone so far that a neighboring country attacks with full force against another neighbor, yes, with full force now, we can return to the topic of mobilization. But yes, bit by bit with increasing full force. Let's jump to the topic of this episode. We've planned a bit beforehand where to talk. A good place to start is your book, Dangerous Peace from 1997, which came out then. I don't know when you wrote it, but it came out then. I can tell you briefly that the first version was ready in 1994. And at that time I was invited to work at the presidential office. And I had to leave it aside partially because the working days were 12 hours. So I did not have a lot of time, and I had 3 teenage children. So at that time, the good thing was that I got to structure the analysis. And in 1997, I had old contacts in the Westview Press. And my excellent editor Richard Levitt was still available, even though he had moved to be an investment banker. So I got through here, and the next year I got a paperback where I added a chapter that examined the Asian financial crisis. At that time it matured so that the chapters became clearer in such a way that the analysis offered predictability that there will not be a peaceful world order, but there will be a new, more organized, competitive, both ideologically and power politically competitive world order. And it was disapproved a bit, even when there was a review in the foreign press. I don't remember the exact date, but it was a bit critical, and the Helsingin Sanomat newspaper naturally dismissed and stuck with it. That the book was criticized in the United States. But then when the reviews started coming from India and from other American analysts, it got a positive review. And that was thanks to the fact that I had not given up to the point that a power political component dynamic could be moved from the analysis to the side, because it was clear that there would be countless countries in the world that would not be capable of a democratic system and a rule of law, and for them the war method would remain a part of the power fighting. And I was very upset when the foreign policy of Finland changed in the beginning of the 20th century, when we tried to continue the policy that had ended in 1991. When the Soviet Union was breaking up, and we returned good relations. Russia is the basis of our foreign policy, and then we have the United Nations, and then we have the EU, and then there was this idea that a strategic alliance was created between the EU and Russia, which is backed by energy. And the driving force was Prime Minister Pavel Lipponen. And then we had the President Halonen, who promoted the traditional era of Finno-Soviet YYEA treaty that ended in the 1980s. Without the YYEA treaty, she came up with the idea that even if the YYEA history, its content is not. And this is how we chose this path in the 90s and 2000s, which came to a conclusion on the 24th of February 2022. And of course, during the Niinistö period, there was this kind of balancing, that the relations between the United States rose back to a significant role. But he did not take the lead in the direction for the Finnish preparation. After all, during his time, the Crimea was occupied, so it should have been the last alarm siren that would have been put on, that our security environment would change once and for all. So this was the introduction. Thank you for the introduction. Was that the international reaction? I'm going to have to psychoanalyze these people. Is this related to the ecstasy that was at the time? The Fukushima end of history. That now we have won this Cold War. I think we had high hopes. I was quite young at the time and did not understand anything. But what I have looked back on now, I have noticed that now the West won, capitalism won, liberalism won. So was that question delicate? Or was it this that was delicate? We had a situation in Finland when we were talking about Westernization, and many such forces rose up saying that this Westernization has gone too far. And, for example, Prime Minister Esko Aho criticized Martin Ahtisaari that he is too American a president. I always had doubts about what he meant. But lately I have found out what he meant. And in that way, I don't recognize myself as one of those that it would have been naive. Because for me this power politics was quite clear. Invasion of Czechoslovakia was a personal experience form. I had just written to matriculate. And I realized that this world is a dangerous place. And it left a mark on me, man. And in the Foreign Affairs Administration, we had our division, at least in two. Already in the early 70s, when I entered the service in Foreign Affairs myself, when I was 23 years old, as an assistant until the end of the term, I realized that our house will be divided in a big picture, world politics in a big picture. And I was on the side where, in a big picture, our best method in the 70s and 80s was to strengthen our neutrality, because it gave us room to move, and strengthen our positions to the West, because we had another school that evaluated the world in such a way that in this big Eastern-Western crisis, we have to understand more or less this Eastern peace policy, which was understood as a peace policy. And in the 80s, our neutrality dried up. And when we talk about the East, we talk about Russia and China. China and Russia had their own Cold War, a mini Cold War, even in the 80s. And that is understandable in the current situation, how it goes. And in this way, when we came to the 90s, we had this identity crisis, where we belong, East or West, and that's why this huge powerful Ahtisaari ended up. And I also felt it in me bones. It was unreasonable, because this was not really a question, but it was a question of taking the opportunities that this new situation offered us. So we were no longer controlled by Moscow in the way we used to, but I did not understand then as much as I do now that part of our foreign administration elite did not agree to this. They had been in contact for 20 years with Moscow's undercover diplomats and their diplomats, whose mission was to subjugate Finland, piece by piece, to Russia's interests. So these people did not go long. Pavel Leoponin mentioned before he became prime minister how Finland will take care of Russia's interests in the EU, in Helsinki and not in Brussels, when it comes to Finland. He went so far as to say that the northern dimension, which he named in September 1997, means a strategic alliance between Russia and the EU, and that's what makes us different from NATO's structure. Mauno Koivisto in 2009 said in a yearly interview that before some said we were bowing to the east, but now we are bowing to the west. Koivisto was the one who strongly promoted as a former president, that we should not go any further towards the West, but that the sign of Finnish identity and independence is that we take care that our integration happens only at the EU level, but by no means with NATO. That was the second Koivisto's thesis in the 2009 interview. The third was that the Baltic countries would not have become independent without the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it is useless for them to be proud of any independence movement that they had, and that it came just as a gift of mercy. This is also a wrong analysis and quite the opposite. The independence movement of the Baltic countries was the one that finally broke the camel's neck and led to the power struggle in Moscow. And Yeltsin came to the Baltic countries and recognized their independence as the president of the Russian Federation almost a year before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we have had differences related to the big picture of the security environment. Ahtisaari was not really a so-called policy leader in the end, because he, especially in 1998 to 1999, accepted the Lipponen model and threw in the towel during the 1999 Kosovo process. That's it. But he did his own work. During a few years, I consider especially important the strengthening of the relations with the Baltic countries, because during the Kosovo's time they were completely frozen, and then in 2000 they froze again because Halonen apparently wanted to freeze them by giving these statements which offended the Balts like Koivisto. Why do you think it is? Of course, it is hard to know what's going on in people's minds, but why is it that there was such a strong unwillingness to integrate more to the West? Is it Navy self-interest? Ideological? Lack of understanding? It is identity crisis, which was born during the long YYE treaty period with the Soviet Union, and we started to think that we have a special role, we are a special case, and we understand Russia more than the Baltics, for example, who were treated very humiliatingly, even on a high level. Only now Sanna Marin has admitted that we were wrong, but we have had a foreign policy opposition in Finland without any political order. And I think that I myself am included in that, because already in 2000 I proposed a constructive public discussion so that we could join NATO at the next stage of expansion. And this was the same thing as shutting myself out from the influential Finnish persons, and this is what happened. But it did not mean this happened to many others who were branded as Westernizers. A very unpleasant label, in this sense, because it was not at all defined. And I see that at the Jakautuuko in the Russian embassy, there were Finnish contacts and assistants in the 2000s who threw the fuel into the fire or water in the mill. In this sense, it would not be a coincidence that a long-time member of parliament, former veteran of the Communist Party, Jakautuuko, led this campaign against NATO in the 2000s, and he has been presumably with a background as a KGB recruited. He was the deputy chairman of the Parliamentary Defense Committee for 20 years. The thing is that in the beginning and end of the Cold War, we did not have a clear purge in our government and in politics, in economy, from the people who have provably cooperated with the intelligence services of the Soviet Union, it was a big mistake, and now we pay for it. There would not have been, if we had a clear purge, there would not have been the Fortum catastrophe in Russia, and we would have realized how bad the Russian economy is for investments. What do you mean? Why? This is a direct result from a wrong analysis of Russia that I have just described and how it was created. We had an idealized picture of the relations between Finland and Russia, and who are responsible for it. Our East Office, Pavel Lipponen, Esko and other professionals, lobbyists, who also cashed in on the Russian politics and trade and gave such a Russia analysis that should have been much more alarming than it was. I would say that it presents the possibility that this will lead to a crisis for Finland, this continuous economic deepening. Look at the return of the Jokerit Ice Hockey Club from Moscow, tail between the legs, and the team have almost been destroyed, really. It remains to be seen if the team can make a comeback or if they have to establish a new club before a civilized return to the Finnish National League is possible. This is one part of the soft power that Putin used. I have discussed this with many officials. The hybrid war was a huge success for Russia. And if this had continued, without Putin impatiently using military force, now the crime was already lost. Without the West reacting practically in no way, the West accepted it, and the Georgian War was the same, and our government practically broke to the Russian sanctions question. We know that Erkki Tuomioja gave dissenting written opinion in August 2014, which of course should not have been made public, but now this seems laughable. But after that, the Finnish foreign policy was of that type, and now the Finnish non-alignment also included a political dimension. But this was not only about Finland, right? This was about the whole West. Yes, the whole West botched. But now we have responsibility for our own country and our own foreign policy. We were part of the West. With Germany, Finland and Germany, again, Poland and the Baltic countries were thought as a nuisance. And there were some other countries that were part of this nuisance group. So now we have to admit that it went wrong. If you look at the book and its other predictions, predicting is very hard. And I think in the current time it is interesting to read. Predictions for the future, I think it takes courage to predict, because that you start with being wrong in many cases. But if you look back, it has been 25 years since the publication of the book. So we have a lot of understanding. If you critically evaluate your own book, which things were right and which were wrong. Good question. Markus Salome, who is a professor of military science, has written about these. In one of the interviews, he said that all the predictions in the book were correct, but let's say, I don't want to be a fortune teller, because it was based on an analysis. There was data and an assessment of the nature of international order, and I just did not believe that all the conflicts can be solved peacefully, like they can't. And there are conflicts where force is used, and this will continue. We have started another Cold War, and this will last for years, but it can develop differently than before. But we will talk about that later. I say that there are not many people on focus in the book. It is based on the analysis of the structures and the development of the structures, where the humanitarian aspect is also in the background, in the study of the security policy. It is said that some people have an animal spirit, and if you look at the security policy, there should be more people who have this animal spirit, because you have to sense things intuitively. And I would say that claiming that I have an animal spirit, sometimes as a diplomat, I felt that I had perhaps that kind of dimension in my thinking, which I could demonstrate by examples from my career, but let's skip them now. These would demonstrate situational insights that should be there. I read one interview of an ambassador who could not think that today there are problems you cannot solve using diplomacy. I thought that if you think like that, it is chiefly an educational problem. Have we had so that our university hasn't presented the basic issues of international politics in the right way, that a decent diplomat says this, because it is not like that. Diplomats have to understand that there are evil forces who only want to harm us, even if they speak friendly. So in this regard, I would say that a world war was never predicted, but a conflict for sure. It was predicted that after 20 years, there will be a hegemonic war. Then there is a question of whether we end up using a force. That is dangerous. And now there is the situation that Ukraine can be seen as the first act of the Second Cold War. When the first Cold started, the violent act was the Korean War. And then the question is, can we avoid the Cuban crisis and go straight to the detente phase, which would mean that between the partner countries of the United States and the partner countries of China, could we go without a threat phase of a nuclear war, straight to the detente phase? And is there, on the other side, in China, the kind of people in power? And here we come to the personage question, who would have the wisdom to take the chance that even if we have different opinions permanently, and we fight ideologically, once again, that regardless, there would be a reason that we don't start a nuclear war. We don't even, other than proxy wars. There were wars during the Cold War. They were called proxy wars, like Afghanistan. And Africa was one of those in Latin America. These policies were tried out. Cuba was one example. But both understood that we should not start a world war. And the Cuban crisis led to the Soviet Union having to withdraw. To save their face, really, a secret treaty was made and the United States would withdraw the Jupiter-class missiles from Turkey. And then it happened that Khrushchev lost his position as the head of the party anyway in August 1964. And now you can think that if Putin has a threat, apparently in the Kremlin there are hardliner hawks who require stronger military actions, that the war in Ukraine will not end this way, but it will be finished, and quickly. So that line has now won, presumably, and they're rare. They're special people chosen as possible followers of Putin, like Dmitry Patrushev, the son of current head of the Security Council, who is the Ministry of Agriculture and has graduated from FE's B Academy. He was born in 1977, such a fellow. And there are speculations like that. You hear waiting in the wings. Let's keep that in mind. I would like to challenge a little bit about the prediction. This might go beyond what you mean, that all your predictions were right. I would like to emails paraphrase that I predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in my book After the Cold War, but I don't want to go there now. But I'm not a magician, nor a fortune teller, but everything is based on analysis. And if I have to predict how this will go today, I have brought up here a new Cold War. It can last for years, maybe tens of years, but at the same time we can get to detente phase faster. This is not a trick question. I understand. There was a lot of talk about the Western community, the importance of transatlantic community in the New World Order. Could you see at that time one example from the book where you talk about the Pan-American Circle, or what do you call it? The big problem, the United States problem, is that they have to manage political instability in the Central and South America. It's a Cold War continuation, maybe. Could you have ever seen any kind of instability, especially in the United States, but also in the EU? This is a big challenge for the transatlantic relations. Now it looks stronger than ever, as Stubb said, but a war was required. The United States is wrestling more with itself than with Central and South America. I have to say, I haven't heard anything about the internal political development of the United States, but in the last few months, I have seen a correction. The January 6th committee has been important, shaping the atmosphere. The Republican Party is as important as the Democratic Party in the United States. It has guaranteed fluctuation between opposition and government. They have a constitution that does its work better than in the Nordic countries that have fallen into the consensus thinking. The danger is that when there is no discussion, no one has an opinion. Everybody agrees, but no one has an opinion any longer. The danger is that we lack strong opposition. Democracy is based on the opposition and the government changing, not staying immobile. In Sweden, just 40,000 votes decided that the power will change, and it can save the Swedish democracy. Just like in the United States, Kennedy was elected with about 40,000 votes. against Nixon.
Ja se omalla tavallaan oli tärkeää, koska se
It was important because
Kennedy oli vahvempi
Kennedy was a stronger power
identiteetin vahvistamista.
in strengthening the Western identity than Nixon had been.
Suri Kennedy
That's why me generation
ja sitten vielä enemmän Robert,
grieved Kennedy's death,
joka oli mulle tämmöinen
and even more Robert Kennedy. At least he was my hero. When there was the Czechoslovakia,
toisaalta oli
there was Robert Kennedy.
tämmöisiä niin kuin
They were the ones who shaped
kuvaa muodosta.
my worldview.
Ja se on
It was interesting.
Kekkonen, eikä
Not our President Kekkonen.
sitten myöhemmin oli
Later there was Mannerheim
tällaisia
and Stolber,
tärkeitä ja monia muita.
many others.
Mutta sillä tavalla niin mä katsoisin, että
I would say,
tämän lännen säilymisen kannalta
for preserving the West, think about it.
Sputnikit,
In the end of 50s, there was Sputniks.
että sosialistiset maat,
It looked like the socialist countries would overtake technologically. They would have a more humane society
yhteiskunta ja
than the capitalism
markkinatalouden pohjalta.
that is based on the market economy.
Sitten tuli Kennedy,
Then there was Kennedy, the Beatles, and many others, and all started to look quite different.
meillä oli
We still had agitprop in Finland, and we prepared legislation
arvostelu
that would have criminalized
ja
criticizing Soviet Union and all this stuff.
niin me jäätiin nytkin
We are even now, again,
viimeisessä
coming on board in the last moment,
uskalletaan ymmärtää
to dare to understand freedom of speech, market economy,
markkinatalosta
rule-based market economy, even if it was regulated, and the rule of law. There we have muddled along
rämmitty tosi pahasti.
in a very bad way.
Neuvoston jäsen vasta
Finland joined the Council of European not until in 1989, and this was visible in shortcomings of our legislation and in certain aspects of our police culture and so on.
nyt me ollaan niin kuin
Now we are in the situation that for the first time
itsenäisyyden
after independence,
voitaisiin olla nyt itsenäisiä.
we could be independent.
Ja 30-luvullakin
In the 1920s and 1930s,
jotain semmoista
we had more independence identity than during the Cold War.
aikana, jolla me jotenkin
We somehow shaped ourselves.
itsenäisiä
Our independence was shaped.
sellaiseksi, miten nyt sanoisi,
There has to be
osittain tämmöinen niin kuin
partial state loyalty.
uskollisuus.
Finns cannot be
Et
proper citizens
kunnon kansalaisia, ellei ne
and at the same time
valtiouskollisia ihmisiä.
be state loyal.
Valtion pitäisi itse asiassa olla, se pitäisi olla,
It has to be the other way around.
valtion pitää olla
The
meidän.
state has to be in our service, not us in the service of the state,
Me nyt oltaisiin semmoisessa
so that we were now in a balanced situation.
valtion
The state is in our protection
niitä
for those who are not able
tai
or can,
ja se
and that would be a good thing.
mutta sitten toisaalta niin
But on the other hand,
kun
we should respect differences and let people speak freely
ihmisten puhua,
and not mock for some differences in opinion.
jos on vähän eri mieltä.
Earlier when you said
Aiemmin tuossa, kun sanoit Alpo,
that you are a westernizer,
kirjoitin, mä en tiedä,
I don't understand. I am a westernizer. Are you a westernizer? It's hard to understand because we grew up in the West. I see Finland as a part of West from start to finish, but we were born in a different world, and we see this, and perhaps with our and the younger generation, the situation will finally change, because we also don't have the burden of the old knowledge. I have thought that
Ajatellut, että yksi
one thing that we lack
puuttuu on esimerkiksi meidän
is the real influence
todellisen vaikutus
of the Communist Party,
niin kuin
the fact that it was funded by Moscow,
rahoitettu Moskovasta.
and what other parts of our political system
Meidän poliittista järjestelmää
got financial support from Moscow. And there is no free lunch. And that is own thing.
kuinka paljon tämä vaikuttaa
And how much this affected the 2000s. And some of your generation,
sunkin sukupolven
young politicians,
on ikään kuin
don't understand this.
mitä on ollut.
What has happened and how the influence,
Jos nyt olisi
if it were a leftist,
liiton
I would establish a completely new party.
mä perustasin kokonaan uuden.
I would realize that this has been seen.
Tämä on niin kuin nähty.
this movement.
Ja kun
Lai Anderson said,
sanoi, että
Niin mäkin muuten.
NATO
is not in our value group.
yhteisö
She said this in the winter.
on tuossa talvella.
No one cared.
Tarttunut siihen ja se oli itse asiassa aika kova.
And it was a pretty tough position.
Niin mä kysyn
I asked what is the alternative value group?
yhteisö.
In the NATO group,
Okei.
okay, Switzerland. But everyone there knows
Tietää sieltä.
there is no Switzerland without NATO. Well, but we have seen
Mehän ollaan nähty
that NATO is not a uniform value group.
arvoyhteisö.
There is a lot of internal differences.
Turkista niitä ei ole
For example, from Turkey. So it is not that stupid, right? I understand.
Joo, totta kai mä
Of course, I also thought
eihän se mene noin.
that it is not like that.
Okei, joo.
But it was jibe against NATO.
Käytettiin vaan tää arvoyhteisö.
Everyone understands
NATO ei ole.
that NATO is not,
Miksi nyt sanon?
what do I call it,
Tai
Stromso or Sandhamnen, an ideal place. But
se
I felt it as the last jibe
tölväsynä
against
sitä vastaan, että se on military.
that it is a militaristic environment.
Ja sittenhän tuli,
And then came the discussion
ei saisi niinku military.
that you can't militarize the EU and Finnish foreign policy. And this is very important
Tuoda esille,
to bring up
mitä militarismilla tarkoitetaan.
what militarism means
Ja
and what does it not mean.
se ei ole militarismia,
It is not that the general has a uniform,
vaan se on siis,
but it is the system
että armeija
that the army can operate.
Ukrainassa.
We have seen it in Ukraine
Armeija, jossa on
that the army has a clear system
valtasuhteet muut.
of power relations, jurisdiction, and so on, and that works. But then you have a group of criminals that are violent murderers.
Tämä nähtiin Bosniassa.
We saw this in Bosnia,
Hirvettäväksi.
that the war became atrocious
Oikeastaan kohdistui
because it was aimed at civilians. The war should be waged between soldiers, not like now,
niin, kun se nyt näyttää kehittyvän.
that it is aimed at civilians.
Mutta tässä
But here is the Russian
venäläinen
war theory
verrattuna siihen käsitykseen
compared to what is taught in NATO
sodankäynnistä.
about war,
Ei NATO-sotilaita
that soldiers of NATO countries are not taught
opeteta tappamaan
to kill civilians,
suojelemaan siviilejä.
but to protect civilians in wartime also.
Se on
It is just like that.
Mä oon ollut
I have been working in the field enough
riittävästi, mä tiedän tämän.
in the Balkans, and I know this,
Ja sitten
that this is the difference.
ja
And when the Winter War started in Finland,
sota syttyi niin
the bombings were aimed at civilians' targets,
siviilikohteisiin.
even though the Soviet Union tried
Välttää
to deny that we tried to
yritettiin
target soldiers in Helsinki,
tuli niinku
but they were aimed at civilians,
maailmalla suurta huomiota,
and it attracted a lot of attention internationally
että nyt
and was considered outrageous that
sodan
the Soviet Union is targeting civilians. But we should have known that from the Great Wrath between 1713 and 1721,
se toimi. Ihan samalla tavalla kuin ne
how the Russians act, just like they did now in Bucha, Ukraine. They acted in East Bothnia Pojanme.
Jos miettii
If we think about the next steps of the war,
sanotus sille, mitä ehkä itse
I think it was an interesting statement
tai näyttää
that there could be a long-term conflict, and that if we view it
tämän sodan kautta, niin
through a new Cold War. So how should this be analyzed?
Venäjällä tätä
This episode is recorded
on keskiviikko 21. päivä.
on Wednesday, the 21st of September 2022,
Se tieto
at noon.
nyt on tämä. Mut
The information we have is this.
kannallepano,
The Russians are mobilizing,
osittainen.
kyllä.
partially mobilizing.
Niin miten tässä pitäisi
So what should we think
nyt seuraavista askeleista?
about the next steps?
Sanon
I would like to mention
laajempaan kehykseen
that Putin said in 2015 in his UN speech
puhe YK:ssa, jossa hän sanoi, että
that the current world order
järjestelmä on epäoikeudenmukainen
is unfair
ja se pitää se pitää
and a new world order
tulla uusimaan.
should be put in place. The Russians also said
Näen myös
that Europe needs to make
ehdotukset, että Eurooppaan pitää
a
tehdä
new security agreement.
tämä
The CE's is seed-based European security system needs to be changed
tavallaan uuden jalka.
in order to establish a new Jalta Treaty.
Ja tähän liittyy
And this was related to China Without China's permission, there would not have been the war in Ukraine. Putin did not go to Ukraine completely unprepared, without securing his back. The question is, as this war went badly, how will China react? I am sure that China will not withdraw its support, but will let it go. And how will this lead to the situation in Taiwan, which is also now in focus? We know from China's view, Taiwan is very important. You know, these semiconductor manufacturers and how China is dependent on certain raw materials and how China's demographic development has been, and now when the economy has stopped, it leads to unemployment and it adds destabilization. They are also afraid that this long-term stagnation, it's not a coincidence that the share of Kohn Corporation has dropped 50% this year because of China's housing crisis and infrastructure projects. Yes, now a strong company like Kohn might face the fact that their evaluation of China might have been wrong. Should they have been more careful in making new deals? Because at some point, they should have seen that the construction sector might overheat. Here we come to the big picture. Okay, there is a war in Ukraine, but it is related to the 2015 picture. I'm a bit surprised that Putin is still using this world order argument that Ukraine belongs to Russia. We know that without Ukraine, Russia will become an Asian country. Ukraine would guarantee that Russia would be an Euro-Asian country. And that's why there is this type of geopolitical struggle behind. And then I come back to how much Finland has understood this Russian logic. Once again, I bring up Lipponen interview in 1994 in Suomen Kuvalehti magazine, where he said, I have come from Moscow, where I have been told that if Belarus and Ukraine strive for Western structures, then we have to form a military alliance with Belarus and Ukraine. In 1994, where did he get this information? It means that if this has started to affect Lipponen's worldview, that Finland's policy can never be supporting Ukraine because it would be against Russia's interests. So is this an explanation that the Soviet government started negotiations with Turkey and forgot Ukraine completely? And is this a strategic mistake of EU that Ukraine was forgotten? And we've always known that Turkey can never become a full member of the EU because it is an Islamic country. As EU full members, we can take Macedonia, for example, where 25% of the population is Islamic. In the future, we can take Kosovo too, even Albania and Bosnia. But there the question is whether the country is divided in two. They are civilized, divided Islamic elements. I know this good enough, as I have been an ambassador in these countries there are the relations,
siellä tämä yhteys,
this connection between people.
sanotaan, että se ei ehkä
It's perhaps not as easy
helppo kuin
as within Finland with Finnish speaking
ruotsalaisten,
and Swedish speaking
ruotsalaisten ja kantaväestön
populations,
yhteys.
but it is not in any sense hostile.
Mielinen.
It can be calmed down,
Niin kuin rauhoitettua ja Euroopan
and the EU integration is such that,
joka juuri noin
especially in those countries,
se, joka
it would finally
rauhoittaisi nämä.
calm down the cross-population relations.
Turkki on kokonaan
But Turkey as a whole is such that
päivänä, että
I just asked now who had this idea that Turkey would become a full member. Well,
kyllä se siis kumppanuus kyllä
partnership for sure,
asema
and a special status and so on for sure. But a full member,
Ei ainakaan just nyt.
at least not now.
kymmeniä vuosia kehitys
Their development has to go on 4 decades.
sitten, mutta ei se
But it is not out of the question.
olisi valtava hieno,
And it would be a great,
mutta jälleen tullaan
we'll come back to these realities, that
ei tiettyä historiaa
certain historical developments
nopeuttaa niin paljon
can to be accelerated so much
eteenpäin.
that we cut 100 years forward. Let's talk about China.
Meillä on vähän aikaa
Joo.
We have some time to talk about these. Let's talk about China.
Sulla on Kiinasta tehty tässä viime aikoina
We did a few episodes about China,
Nordean pääekonomistin kanssa.
latest with Julie Koivu, the chief economist of Nordea Bank. We asked if China's economy would collapse.
Koivun mielestä
She said no.
nyt vaikuttaa siltä, että
China is an authoritarian country
valtio, jolla on
with massive reserves
valuuttareservit ja erilaiset
and different ways to maintain it,
siis
if nothing else,
jopa niin kuin viimeistellä nämä
but to finish the infrastructure projects.
infrastruktuurakennukset siis tarvittaessa.
If it looks like
Jos näyttää siltä, että
people who can't get their homes,
alkaa kotiaan alkaa
they have ways to handle this in the short term,
ainakin niin kuin lyhyellä aikaa
but it does not look good
kuitenkaan heidän osalta pitkä.
in the long run.
Niin,
The vision of New World Order off the Cold War was
uudessa kylmässä sodassa
that China would rise on par with the West
maiden rinnalle tämmöiseksi haasteeksi.
as a challenger.
Edelleen, että se on nykytilanteessa
Is it still a viable option?
vaihtoehto ja millä.
And how?
Onko se ratkaisu nimenomaan BRICS-blokki tai
Is BRICS a viable option?
niin, vastaan vaan.
As a system, China is not a viable option.
Mutta siis me tiedetään jo,
But we know that the economy,
Siis
ei
we don't want to adapt.
kannata mennä siihen lankaan, että
We should not go there.
kun on tämmöinen ryhdikäs,
That such an upright policy sure works there.
sitä ei kannata.
China's problem is the system.
On nimenomaan järjestelmä.
We'll come to that
Tullaan siihen
at some point.
jossain vaiheessa nimittäin
The control,
kontrolli ylittää,
the benefits
sanotaan, että hyödyt kontrollista
from the control are less
kuin se, että annetaan.
than the freedoms.
joo, siis autoritäärisestä
The pitch for the last few years has been,
hitaasti nämä demokratiat.
look how slowly the democracies react.
Mut
We can't do anything.
sellaista niin kuin valtiollista idiotismia.
But the authoritarian idiocy exists nowhere else than in the autocracies,
Tietoisia, jotka ei ymmärrä
who don't know themselves, who don't understand what the people think. Perfect massive mistakes,
näy samalla tavalla demokratia.
which we don't see in democracy.
Tämä NATO on
In Finland, the sharp increase in NATO support
rajun
past the political elite
eliitin
is a small hint that
viittaus vähän siihen, että meilläkin oli tämä
we had a reserved culture in
ulkopoliittinen kulttuuri,
foreign policy, but the people
kuitenkin ties.
nevertheless understood quite a lot.
Mutta
Okay, but as a system,
olemaan,
China will not be a challenger,
mutta
but the economic focus
siirtynyt Aasiaan.
has moved to Asia. We know that.
Tässä tapahtuu jotain
But on the other hand,
reaktiota, että koska yritykset
there's a counter reaction.
pois sieltä, kun siellä
Companies withdraw their products
eli
when the prices have risen.
globalisaatiovaihe
One globalization period is over.
voi olla, että siis
Perhaps globalization, like in the 90s,
alkoi
is perhaps over.
ja
And
tässä suhteessa
China is kind of a losing here.
niin jos
They should have
ylläpitää tätä globalisaatiota
kept the globalization going
10-20 vuotta.
for 10 to 20 years.
Tätä niin
And now we have come to a stall for China.
kannalta. Myöskin
The ecology has also faced a wall. The country's environmental pollution
maan saastuminen
is on that level,
sitä luokkaa ja ilmastonmuutos
and climate change is making things difficult.
siellä monia asioita.
They have to take into account things they haven't taken into account before.
Sekä kuivuutta että
Paradoxically, both drought and fire. They have to do a lot of work
Ihan tämän oman
for the development of their own infrastructure,
kehittämiseksi sellaiseksi, että
for it is to last
siis tämän
for a billion people
ihmisen
without
väestön ilman, että
their being. Maybe I can tell you,
mä saan tässä kertoa sitä, että kun mä
when I was in 1997 in a meeting
Kiinan presidentin kanssa,
with the president of China in the dead city
siellä ei ollut muuta kuin neuvonantajat ja
with only the leaders and interpreters
lähettiläät
and ambassadors
Jiang Zemin kanssa.
and the president Jiang Zemin.
Muistan sen, kun Jiang Zemin
I remember when he explained
demokratia niin kuin
that China will become a democracy
se kestää pitkään.
like in the West,
Että meille tulee oikeusvaltiokin
but it will take a long time,
ja
and that we will have a rule of law
markkinatalous.
like in the West, and we have a market economy quite far like in the West.
Ja mulle jäi
And I remembered this quite vividly when, until in 2012,
hiitu.
Thaxi came to power,
Oli selvää, että
and at the same time Putin came to power
valtaa uudestaan.
again,
Silloin tapahtui se, että
and they found each other
toisensa tämmöisenä auto
as autocrats.
ja se on se,
And that was the turning point. In 2012,
sitähän sitä alkoi seurata monia.
many things happened,
Ja ehkä mä
and I could say
sanoin, että sen tie on nyt
that road has come to an end.
tavallaan se
The
2002
2012 phase,
Kiina niin kuin kehittyi tavallaan.
China developed peacefully.
Se oli nimenomaan se, että
It was the peaceful rise
peaceful rise,
of China was the thesis at the time,
se teesi silloin.
and now it has changed a little.
Nyt se on vähän muuttunut.
The soft power has come,
Soft power,
China's Confucianism,
ja kaikki.
and all this.
Pidin tässä luennon
And I gave a lecture in Lithuania
niin
about China
Kiinasta niin, ja identiteettipolitiikasta.
and the identity politics.
Kiinassahan on itse asiassa
And I found out that in China,
tämmöistä punaista fasistista.
they are setting up a red fascist state.
Etno,
It has ethno-national ideology
no.
and all the characteristics
Ja
of the system correspond
tunnusmerkit vasta
to a new type of fascism.
tämmöistä uutta.
And it is sad to admit,
Ja
because I had the same thought,
mullakin oli se käsitys,
that China would become
tulisi tämmöinen erilainen
a different autocracy
ja positiivisessa mielessä.
in a positive way, a soft autocracy.
Jiang Zemin
It was the vision of Jiang Zemin
siellä 97
in 1997
tullaan tähän tilanteeseen, niin
that it would turn this way.
se kääntyykin näin.
And now the question is,
Siitä, että ruokkiiko Venäjä
are Russia and China feeding each other?
ja
And there has been an analysis
että
that China has followed Russia a lot.
Venäjä.
If Russia would have turned into a democratic country, then China would have turned into a democratic country. But actually, Putin
On hyvin pitkä
has for a long time
vaikuttanut siihen, että Kiina
said that China would turn into an authoritarian country. Interesting thought.
jännä ajatus.
It's an analysis
joka löytyy
that is available also elsewhere than in me notes.
muistiinpanoista.
Joo,
Do you remember who this is?
kuka tän on?
I think the best Chinese analysis
Analyysiä on
is Jan Ferguson,
Joo,
ja
and then another Russian analysis
analyysiä
is Timothy Snyder.
Snyder.
But then
Mutta sitten mä oon
I have tried in my own analysis to look at the situation in Finland, to look at our situation, and I back to the case of Fortum
palaan siihen
when the deal was made.
kun se on näin
As soon as it has happened today,
deal,
I will repeat
niin toistan sen, että tässä
that in a way we have
historia opetus
not learned from history
että idänkauppahan
that the trade with Soviet Union ended up about the same way. It was 8.5 billion that Finland had receivables from Russia,
ovat Venäjä
and 200,000 jobs
ja 200 000
were lost without being replaced
uusilla työpaikoilla
with new jobs,
ja valtava määrä yrityksiä
and a huge number of companies fell,
tämän meidän
partly due to deepening effect of
syvemmällä
the Soviet trade combined with overvalued fixed national currency rate. These two factors were caused by ourselves. And why did the Soviet trade end up like that?
meni
Was because
se, että
It was not taken into account that the Soviet trade has lost its fundamentals. About in the years 85 to 86 was the moment when it was time to turn this around and pull this economic activity that had no fundamentals. It was exchange economy like trading squirrel eye skins. It should have been softened. We would have kept many companies alive, and many suicides would have been left undone if we would have made a new analysis in our Russian politics. I am not talking about this. In complete hindsight, I was the head of the research unit in Foreign Ministry, and I presented the perspective of the rupture of Russia. In 1989, I have memorandums and conversations that I brought to our reporting. I was not the only one there, but our space was very small. We have such a strong Russian thinking model. I would call it Feklingilian thinking, which controlled our diplomacy. I am afraid that we have a generation of diplomats who are shocked of what's happened, and they have difficulties to find a way out. You can see it in this visa question, but I don't want to. But I have seen that in the 2000s, the strategic analysis has not been that important. In our diplomacy training, there were only emails per emphasis on human rights questions. But the human rights questions are a very clear thing. We want a world order where human rights are respected. But at the same time, we should be able to understand the dynamics of power politics to build the conditions. You are right that human rights are not implemented. Without a wise security policy, I am no longer a martial artist, but the relationship between militarism and pacifism is clear. The fact that you grow to be a better fighter, the purpose behind it is that you try to create a competent fighter so that you don't have to use them. You are in a position where firstly, you avoid and repel any kind of attacks, and you can act as calmly and logically as possible, because you understand that if something happens, you are able to do something 5 minutes before something aggressive happens. Then you don't have to panic, because you know that if something happens, we don't have as much anxiety as if we were completely helpless. Whereas in pacifism, you are paradoxically more exposed to militarism than to prevention. In a good foreign policy, there is always a bit of pacifism, but in the last phase, there should be a response to the threat of power politics, and in that way, the responsible foreign policy leader talks about the human life, responsibility of human life, and when, for example, the visa question was on the table, when they said that there is no complete legal protection for a perfect blockage regarding the tourist visas, I have always brought up in this kind of situation Helmut Schmidt example, who was the interior minister of Hamburg. I was a former vice consul in Hamburg. I know and I remember this. In 1962, there was a great flood in the North Sea, where 315 people died in Hamburg and 35 around Hamburg. So the interior minister of Hamburg, Helmut Schmidt, made a personal decision to call for help from the army. And in Germany it was against the basic law, because the army could not carry out civilian operations. And it has been calculated that the 25,000 men who also came from NATO as an organization saved 1,000 lives. I have been there when Estonia sank. I was in a situation where I was called 2 in the morning, and I had to go to Maintinimi, the presidential residence. And now the question is why did the Navy ships stay in Turku? No one has made a decision to send one of the warships that surely will not sink onto the sea endeavors and throw them there on the spot. Such a decision was never made, and it has bothered me. If it could have saved tens of people, maybe more, or if it would have been a stupid solution. Why did we send only the helicopters, which were also in great danger? And would these ships have been even less dangerous that we had at our disposal at that time? And the soldiers of the army, that this situation requires risk-taking. But the risk is borne by the one who takes the risk, and it is honorable risk-taking, because it is also a question of human life. Helmut Schmidt was convicted later, but he got a permanent reputation as a statesman, and in that way he also ended his career, because in 1982 he thought that NATO should place these medium-range ballistic missiles here, but his own party, the pacifists, overturned him. And in that way, the Helmut Kohl administration came, which started the investment in November 1983. And it has been said later that without this two-way decision to place these countering forces to the Russian S-20 missiles, the Cold War would have ended. This was Helmut Kohl's view. And the difference between statesmen and politicians is that they can take the risks first and then later take responsibility. We had Risto Ryti, who took a risk and paid for it that he did not have time to think whether this was legal or not. He took the risk and paid for it. And now the visa question. I would have liked that the foreign minister Haavisto would have taken a personal risk, because this is also a question of Finland's safety and Europe's safety. So why did they have to find their way? When the Chancellor of Justice said yesterday, there was also another way. That's why the politicians have been chosen to take the risk when fatherland's security is in question, and then later test and reconcile the responsibility. And if you have to go to jail, then go to jail if you have been able to save thousands of people. So this is the way to think. And that's why democracy, the oppositions must sharp, so that it clarifies issues at hand and speeds up the politicians to do the job they have been chosen for. This went to become a bit of a rant, but it was not meant to be. I think this was a good end of the episode. This was really good. Maybe we will have to take the next round. Very interesting episode. We went through 1/10 of what we were supposed to talk about. Thank you for coming. During the years, we have been talking to all kinds of people. I will not forget this. I appreciate that I was invited. Hopefully, we will meet again. Thank you to all the viewers and listeners. And Vili, thank you. And you, Samuel. Take on our channel. More is coming. Bye bye.